Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. I heard the news about the renaming of Fort Hood, Texas to Fort Cavazos, and that's for Richard Edward Cavazos, 1929 to 2017. He was the Army's first Hispanic four-star general with service in Korea and Vietnam. The news got me thinking about the original naming of Fort Hood. And I must confess, because I spend the vast majority of my research time in the 19th century, I don't really go into the 20th century that much. So I thought, well, let me look at newspapers.com and see what I can find to help me understand the backstory and the origins of the original naming of the fort as Fort Hood. And probably the first big revelation for me was that it was originally Camp Hood, and it came about in February of 1942. World War II is only a few months old, and the military, the Defense Department, and the whole military industrial complex is cranking up, and Kyleen, Texas becomes the home to this center for tank destroyers and firing. It's sort of a center that comes about. So I found a really interesting article in February 1942 issue of the Fort Worth Star Telegram, which gives a little bit of backstory, really in the form of a biography of General John B. Hood, which I think makes some interesting descriptions about his Confederate war service, his larger military service in the U.S. Army, and connects it to a certain movie that became popular around that time. Let me read the story to you. It's not terribly long, but listen closely as you hear me talk about his military service in context to 1942. And so here we go. Quote, "The new Army cantonment at Kyleen, Texas, has been named Camp Hood in honor of the Confederate General John B. Hood, leader of the famous Texas Brigade. A Kentuckian by birth, but a Texan by adoption, this historical figure took part in nearly all the great battles of the Civil War. Hood was born June 1st, 1831, at Owingsville, Kentucky. His father wanted him to study medicine, but instead he entered West Point, completing an undistinguished career as a cadet in the same class with Sheridan, McPherson, and Schofield. After brief duty in New York and later in California, he was transferred to Texas to join the 2nd Cavalry, which was then under command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. Hood was wounded in the leg in a scouting expedition against marauding Indians in July 1857 and partially incapacitated for 2 years. This, incidentally, was but a forerunner of repeated wounds which he was to receive in battle in the Civil War that was on the horizon. In April 1861, he resigned his commission, joined the Confederate Army, and was sent as first lieutenant to Yorktown, Virginia, where he was put in charge of cavalry attached to the forces of General John B. Magruder. By rapid promotion, Hood became Brigadier General on March 2nd, 1862, organized and took command of the Texas Brigade. He personally led these troops into action at Gaines's Mill, broke the Federal line on June 27, 1862, and won high reputation. Hood and the Texas Brigade substantiated that reputation by hard, successful fighting at 2nd Manassas and Antietam. Partly at the insistence of Stonewall Jackson, Hood was promoted to Major General October 11, 1862, after the Maryland Campaign. He took part in action at Gettysburg, where his troops became the 1st Division of Longstreet's Corps. There, Hood pleaded to be allowed to attempt to turn Round Top, but instead was ordered to attack up the Emmitsburg Road, where he was badly wounded in the arm on the afternoon of July 2nd. From Gettysburg and until the end of the war, Hood's name figured in battle after battle: Chickamauga, Atlanta, Nashville, Franklin. Perhaps his campaign before Atlanta, where he replaced General Joseph E. Johnston, is best known of all his war activities, thanks to the book Gone with the Wind. Assuming full responsibility for his subsequent defeats at Nashville and Franklin, which were really flanking attempts to force Sherman to withdraw from Georgia, Hood asked to be relieved, and on January 23, 1865, bade farewell to his troops. He was on his way to the Trans-Mississippi Department with orders to collect troops to reinforce Lee. And the story continues when capitulation of the last Confederate army led him to ride into Natchez, Mississippi, and surrender on May 31, 1865. Minus a leg, which was amputated after a wound at Chickamauga, he returned to Texas, where he made good business connections and soon set up as a factor and commission merchant in New Orleans. For a while, he was successful, but made several unwise ventures and was reduced to poverty. The family was stricken by yellow fever in 1879, and his wife and eldest daughter died. He is buried in New Orleans. So there you have the newspaper story from February of 1942. And I think it's really interesting the way that they have articulated and discussed Hood's career. You see, there's a reference to the undistinguished cadet, which I think sort of strikes a Ulysses S. Grant kind of a vein. He wasn't the well-known, popular cadet. He wasn't the academic success. And then they spend an awful long time talking about his early experience during the Peninsula Campaign, and they mention Second Manassas. So they're talking about 1861, 1862, heavy emphasis and mentions of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. So you're really playing to those first couple of years when the Confederate Army was quite successful. And also notice the downplaying of the activities later on in the war, the actions at Nashville, at Franklin, and describing those actions as not necessarily battles, but focusing on flanking movements to force Sherman to act, and also his taking full responsibility for his actions. So it's an interesting spin, really, on the story of Hood compared to how we think about Hood today. So wanted to share that with you just to give you some context around General Hood in light of the name change of the fort that bore his name for, 60 years, 61 years. So there you have it. Until the next episode, take care.